A pleasure to meet all at last, and today we're back at it again with HJN Season 5, Rails and Ties, specifically talking about railroads of all sorts. For number 3103, we've come around to talk about something that's a bit on the lesser known side of things, Ann Arbor. Ann Arbor is certainly not like most other railroads out there. While today it is seen as an active short line that was originally started as the Toledo Ann Arbor in North Michigan as far back as 1878. The thing is that its operations today are mostly of short line relations, class 3 if you will. I had already talked about the Indiana Harbor Belt as well as a handful of other railroads that happen to have their own sort of correlations to short line systems, and more importantly, the operations that connect to freight services operating in a smaller scale, usually 100 miles or less of trackage. But even in comparison to the Indiana Harbor Belt, the Ann Arbor happens to be even smaller for what it is. 50 miles of trackage running from select parts in Toledo, Ohio and Arbor, Michigan. The thing is, it's pretty small for what it is. It had unfortunately gone through financial problems leading up until around 1973. A supposed reorganization took place, and unfortunately, it only went along so well until their full-on merger with Conrail took place 3 years later in 1976. The Great Lakes Central Railroad was ultimately a big part of the abandonment that Ann Arbor unfortunately had to go through. And maybe more importantly though, the route, I will say, is actually pretty unique because after all, there is a ferry service that goes through Lake Michigan leading up to the Upper Peninsula segment of Michigan itself. After all, going down to Toledo, Ohio and then going all the way northwest to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, you would think that maybe they'd have like a bridge or something that would interconnect to it, but because it's a pretty big gap with all the water in there at Lake Michigan, of course the car ferry service is mainly put together. But let's be real though, there has been a lot of ways in order to bring about the likes of Ann Arbor itself. And well, as it turns out, there has in fact been an Ann Arbor that has been running since 1988, 12 years after the original Ann Arbor had existed. So you could say this is more like a bonus. The history of the original was pretty long for what it is, lasting almost a full century until Conrail came around. But in 1988, however, while Conrail didn't exactly sell off or share the assets, a good majority of the line that had run through the likes of Ann Arbor itself thankfully were able to be put together by Watco starting in 1988 and running almost 40 years later with the Michigan Interstate Railroad itself as the predecessor, unfortunately going off the same year in 1988. Well, here's the thing though. The Michigan's Interstate didn't exactly hold off all too well, despite being a ways to attempt to rehabilitate some of the older lines, and while it only went along so well, a good majority of the portions from Ann Arbor to Toledo was thankfully salvaged to the point in which that they were able to continue Ann Arbor related railroading with a new livery and some relatively newer equipment. So in many cases, there hasn't been much for me to say, but I at least was able to compile a good amount of things. From 1878 to 1976 and then 1988 to the present, sort of a split off, if you will, in which that Ann Arbor essentially lived a long life at 98 years old, but then came back to life starting in 1988, or essentially as a reincarnation, but still bearing the old Ann Arbor vogue that lasts to the very present. It still at least is worth noting, though. Their presence is at least still a good reminder of what the historical value of the original Ann Arbor was like, in the same regard as to how when there was basically an older Wisconsin Central, and then a new Wisconsin Central was formed by the Sioux Line after they essentially merged in 1961. But this new Wisconsin Central was not only made as a way to reignite the original Wisconsin Central, but at the same time, it also was an excuse for Sioux Line to basically bequeath their older livery to them. After all, Soo Line used to be maroon and yellow until they changed to red and white, and then they handed their old livery to the Wisconsin Central, basically making the Wisconsin Central their successor in a way, while Soo Line continued to operate various other segments of tracks until eventually being absorbed into CP in 1990. And the Wisconsin Central, as we know, went ahead and got themselves bought out by CN in 2001, 11 years later. Meanwhile, it doesn't seem like the current Ann Arbor Railroad is going to be handed off to any of the Class 1s that occupy the East, like Norfolk Southern and CSX. And it probably is for the best that such smaller short lines don't really fall into the hands of the larger railroads. Other than that, though, there's not much for me to say at this point. I will at least give it to them that they have the same sort of principle as what Wisconsin Central went through, having one long life in the beginning, and then eventually going through a merger where they would eventually be reincarnated years later. Ann Arbor pretty much did the same thing, but instead of mergers or absorptions, it was mostly a bankruptcy, and eventually a reincarnation made possible thanks to the efforts of Watco, the same Watco that has been operating Wisconsin and Southern trackage for years now. So, if you want to see more, go down to my channel, then make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side.